Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Washington, D.C. headquarters of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, one of the world's truly great think tanks based in London that each year issues the Military Balance, which is a global survey of military capabilities and all the factors that go into it, from economic to political to technological. And we're honored to have with us Lucie Béraud-Sudreau, who is the defense spending and economics person on the team. You have one of the most interesting portfolios because there's a direct tie between a country's ability to raise money and to buy defense equipment. As you look at global spending trends, what are sort of the key trends we've seen over the past year globally when it comes to the link between economic prosperity and military capability?
So the key trend that we've seen this year in terms of global spending is first the amount, like the total amount that it reached. It's growing. Global spending has reached $1.67 trillion in 2018, and actually this shows two things. The first thing is it's going back towards growth. Whereas in previous years, the growth was very static, very stable. Now it's almost 2% real terms growth in 2018. That's really a turning point compared to a few years back after the oil crash in 2014 and after the financial crisis in 2008. So it's the first thing we can see from this figure. The other is that the drivers, the engines of growth, have shifted geographically from non-Western regions to the West and the US in particular.
And so if you were, one of the big focus areas obviously for everybody is the threat from China and Russia. But both countries actually have a remarkable number of economic challenges. If you look at Russia, there are demonstrations in part because of the impact on sanctions. That in turn has driven Putin to do pension reforms, which are very, very unpopular. In China's case, the US tariffs, trade war, as well as a whole bunch of other factors are dampening down the Chinese economy at the time when spending is at a high. Talk to us about what we're seeing in China and Russia and what we can expect long-term in terms of spending trends.
Absolutely. So regarding Russia and China, we are actually looking at two very different situations. As you've mentioned, they have economic challenges, but the impact on defense spending is quite different in each country. So in Russia, there are real constraints. What we've seen since 2014 is a cuts in defense spending. So even though the Russians have tried to stabilize in nominal terms their budget, which means pretty much allocating the same amount of money in local currency, in real terms, it's actually meant some cuts. So for Russia, the situation is the long-term situation. We might see more cuts coming in the coming years in terms of real terms defense spending. In China, there is a slowdown. However, given the amount of resources and the scope of budgeting resources they can allocate to defense, even though the economy is slowing, they can still have a 6%, 5% real terms growth of their defense budget, which, given the starting point, is actually really big. So I think for what we will see some trends long term is like Russia going down and China still continuing to go up.
And of course explains why the Russians are investing so much in hybrid capabilities to offset the direct military capabilities, right? Which I think is Gerasimov is a pretty smart guy in terms of creating innovative strategies. You talked about sort of the global economic shift, right? The U.S. economy has been very, very hot. Everybody is, there are a lot of economists that are looking at it to see whether or not we can continue this trend. Economic growth slowed down a little bit, obviously in Europe, but European defense spending is up. Walk us through the European defense spending picture as well.
So in Europe, as we've seen over the past few years, since 2014, European defense spending in general has been increasing. And that's due to several factors, right? So on the one hand, in Eastern Europe, you have more the Russian threat perception that plays a role with Eastern countries hiking their budgets quite fast. In Western, like more Western Europe, you have countries such as the UK, France, who are trying to maintain a broad-based capabilities. So not only territorial defense, but also power projection abroad to maintain their interests. But in those countries, trying to do everything at the same time has become more challenging. So their budget is actually, their defense budget growth is not as high as in Eastern Europe. But what we can see is like, even though economic growth is also slowing in Europe, given those high threat perceptions, we can foresee that budgets will continue to grow. And almost every European country has put forward plans, defense investment plans for the next 5 or 10 years, where they say they want to increase their defense budget. And that's true almost across the whole of the continent.
But everybody's eyes are on the long-term strategic implications of Brexit. We've already seen a cooling of the British economy. You live in London, so you see you see this debate on a daily basis. As somebody French who probably is a little bit baffled at everything that's being seen, and I think there are a lot of Brits that fall into the baffled category as well, as well as a lot of Americans, without being discharitable to any of my British government friends. As you look at the potential implications, Ben Barry, retired British Army brigadier, who's obviously a land warfare specialist, talked about the impact in terms of already a gap that the National Audit Office is seeing in British defense, the gap between reality of resources and ambition. Brexit is also going to have an impact on European governments. Germany has already said, for example, we're not going to be as aggressive on defense spending increases. Walk us through what the potential economic implications of Brexit will be, and then how that will carry over to real-term European defense spending.
So the implications of Brexit for defense spending are multiple. You can see if the first one is if there is a no-deal Brexit. We don't know that yet. It might still happen. There will likely be a very severe economic impact on the UK growth. And that might mean that the budget reduces for defense. The other important thing is exchange rates, actually. So sorry to get a bit maybe technical or economic.
Not at all, not at all. You're an economist, so I expect you to get technical.
So the value of the pound actually has an impact on what the Brits can purchase in terms of equipment, because they're buying a lot of kit from the US. So if the value of the pound declines, it means that their arms imports from the US is going to get more expensive for them. So if the budget doesn't grow accordingly, then they might just be able to buy less stuff. And they also have strong, defense industrial cooperation with the European countries, so also buying things from Europe, subsystems, spare parts, etc. So the exchange rate story might also play a role here. And the last impact for the UK is also that because so much political bandwidth is taken up by Brexit, they have less attention on other political issues, but including defense.
Let's look at the rest of Asia. Almost every country in Asia is concerned, not just about North Korea, but also about China, whether it's South Korea, whether it's Japan, Australia, and any one of the other countries, Vietnam. Walk us through on what kind of spending patterns we're seeing there, and extend that into South Asia and in the Middle East also, because this was one year where we didn't spend as much time talking about that. Talk to us about Asia, South Asia, and then also the Middle East in terms of spending patterns.
So the rest of the world.
Exactly, because you're IISS. You are about the world.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start with Asia and Southeast Asia. So what we've seen actually this year is a very contrasted picture in that region, with some countries like China. So as we've said, there's still their defense spending growth is quite high, quite pacey. But in other countries, there's a bit of a mixed picture, like countries like Indonesia or Malaysia, where you've seen more economic difficulties actually, and less willingness to dedicate resources to defense due to upcoming elections or other national priorities. So in countries like Malaysia, for instance, they've tended to prioritize other social expenses over defense. So there've actually been some cuts in Indonesia, sorry, very heavy cuts. So I would say at the moment, Asia is more of a mixed picture than it was a few years ago, where every country was really spending more on defense. So regarding South Asia, if we look at India, for instance, their budget has been growing steadily over the past years. However, their spending pattern is quite interesting, because they do allocate more and more onto personnel and pensions costs over equipment or R&D, despite the government's willingness to develop their own defense industry, for instance. But yeah, the way they've spent their money hasn't gone to that direction.
And now let's move to the Middle East, because it is a region of the world that spends a lot of money, obviously. But in the last couple of years, there's been a big modernization cycle that we went through. But that modernization cycle was building up for years. I mean, it began really in the George W. Bush. A lot of the programs that were recently signed by President Trump began under the George W. Bush administration, were cultivated in the Obama administration, and finally have reached fruition. Talk to us a little bit about Middle East spending patterns and where we're seeing the resources going, and whether or not we should see even stronger spending increases going into the future.
Okay, so when we talk about Middle East defense spending, the first thing that you need to to focus on or to remember is that it's a very, very opaque region. Those countries are absolutely not transparent. For some countries, there's actually no publicly available data, which is what we use to do our work at the IISS. So Qatar or the UAE, which are big arms importer, actually publish no figures on their defense budget. So it's actually a black hole there. For other countries in the region, like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman, we have some data. And actually what we've seen is big spending cuts after 2014 due to a fall in oil prices. And those countries have had to adjust their spending patterns. So that's the first thing. However, they remain one of the largest markets for arms in the world. But it's always the issue of like how you can spend a lot of money, but how efficient is that spending? So if you take, for instance, Saudi Arabia, it's at the moment the third largest defense spender in the world. However, do you still fear Saudi Arabia the same way that you fear Russia? Probably not. So it's not just about spending a lot of money, but how you spend it and what you do with it.
And of course, Iran also has cooled, right? Because I mean, for a while, it looked like the nuclear deal. Talk to us a little bit about the Iranian picture, because if you talk to Emiratis, Saudis, or their focus is obviously all on the guy who's on the other side of the Gulf.
Absolutely. So Iranian defense spending also not a very transparent country. So the way you look at the data for defense budgets is a bit complicated. It's true for all the countries in the region. However, we've done a big effort into trying to understand the budget in Iran this year. We've had some Iran specialists looking at this in particular. And as you said, like the economic constraints in Iran have had an impact on their budget. First, because they've had, again, like for Russia, a very stable budget, but in real terms, it actually means cuts, a strong decrease, and also again exchange rates issues. The way you measure and you compare countries' defense spending is using US dollars, but because the Iranian currency has been falling over the past month and years, it actually means that their budget has been reducing.
Lucie Béraud-Sudreau, who is the defense economist, if I'll say, at IISS, contributed to the Military Balance. It was a real treat talking to you, and looking forward to having you on again.
Thank you very much.